Welcome back to Chapter 7, Principles of Pathophysiology. The topics that we're going to discuss are going to be the cell, the regulation of homeostasis, the cardiopulmonary system, shock, and pathophysiology of other systems. To start off with, we are going to do an introduction to pathophysiology. So it is the study of how disease processes affect the function of the body. Understanding helps you recognize changes that the patient is going through due to illness or injury. And understanding helps you recognize the needs of the body in its most vulnerable state. So let's start off with learning about the cell. So the cell membranes protect and selectively allow water and other substance in and out of the cells. The mitochondria converts the glucose and other nutrients into the adenosine triphosphate, which is also called ATP. ATP is the fuel for the cell's functions, and without it, many of the cells that specialized structures cannot actually function. Here's a diagram of the cell that can also be found in your book. All right, water in the cell. So a cell needs the correct balance of water between its inside and its outside. Water moves into the cell from the environment around the cell. So without enough water, the cell will dehydrate and it'll eventually die. So by contrast, too much water will actually interrupt the basic cell function. So water levels also influence the concentration of the important chemicals, which were called electrolytes. So electrolytes are the substances that, when dissolved in water, separate into charged particles. And then the movements of these charged particles actually enable the electrical function of the cells and serve as the nerve transmission and cardiac muscle depolarization. So it's important electrolytes are in the body and include potassium, sodium, and magnesium. But the levels of water in the body are also controlled by the circulatory and the renal systems, and making sure that you have proper function of these systems, which then will maintain a balance to provide cells the healthy environment that they need. And then the absorption and elimination of water not only provide balance to the cells, but also affect the body as a whole. So here's something to think about. Draw an analogy between cell metabolism and how a refinery turns crude oil into gasoline for the use in automobiles. So glucose and the cell. So glucose is a simple sugar obtained from the foods that are eaten and is the basic nutrient for the cell. It is the building block for energy in the form of the ATP. So during metabolism, glucose is broken down inside the cell and combined with oxygen to create energy that is used to perform cellular functions. Without glucose, though, normal energy production within the cell and normal cell functions cease. So most of the body's cells require the presence of insulin in the blood to help move the glucose from the body and into other cells. Therefore, a consistent supply of insulin must match the body's glucose requirements and be present to ensure that the energy is needed for the cells to meet the cells. And then the levels of glucose and insulin in the body are controlled by the digestive and the endocrine system. Oxygen and the cells. So there's an aerobic metabolism, which is the cellular functions that are using oxygen. And then the anaerobic metabolism, which is the cellular functions not using oxygen. So it creates much less energy and much more waste. The body becomes acidic and impairing many body functions. So here's the aerobic metabolism. It's when the glucose is broken down into the presence of oxygen, which then produces a large amount of energy, or also known as ATP. And in this one, you have the anaerobic metabolism, which is when the glucose is broken down with the presence of oxygen, which produces acidic byproducts and only a small amount of energy, or ATP. Then, of course, you have the vulnerability of cells, organs, and organ systems. So many diseases alter the permeability of the membrane. Its ineffective cell membrane can allow substances into the cell that should not be there. And then these substances can actually interfere with the regulation of water. All right, in this section, let's talk about the regulation of homeostasis. Homeostasis, it is regulated in the brain. It's maintained through the nervous system feedback and messaging, and its key structures are the hypothalamus and the medulla oblongata. All right, the fight or flight response. You will hear this often throughout the chapters, but more so in the respiratory emergencies. So the parasympathetic nervous system, it's either feed or breed functions, and the neurotransmitters that regulate the digestion and the reproduction, and then it reduces heart rate and blood pressure. In the sympathetic nervous system, it's the fight or flight situations. They have the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. It enhances the body's ability to protect itself, and it increases the heart rate and the blood pressure. The cardiopulmonary system. With the cardiopulmonary system, its respiratory and cardiovascular systems work together. So they bring oxygen into the body, distribute to the cells, and remove waste products. And any breakdown can result in a system failure. We talked about this earlier or even in another chapter, but this is what the bronchial tree looks like. So each main stem bronchus enters a lung and then branches into smaller and smaller bronchi, ending in the smallest bronchioles. And then each bronchiole terminates in a tiny air pocket called the alveolar sac. And then the alveoli are encased by networks of capillaries, which are oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange there between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. And next, the airway. You must have an open, patent airway for the system to function. The upper airway obstructions are very common, caused by typically foreign bodies, infections, and trauma. Next, the lungs. They are part of the lower airway. They have tidal volume, which is the volume of air moving in and out during each breath cycle. Then you have the tidal volume times the respiratory rate equals the minute volume, and that is the amount of air moved in and out of the lungs in a 1 minute period. Any decrease in the tidal volume or respiratory rate reduces the minute volume. And then the respiratory dysfunction occurs anytime something interferes with that minute volume. Next, we'll talk about the respiratory dysfunction. So it's the disruption of the respiratory control. So respirations are controlled in the brain by the medulla oblongata. And in any event impacting the function of the medulla oblongata can actually affect the minute volume, which can be infection, drugs, toxins, or trauma. With disruption of pressure. So if a hole is created in the chest wall, pressures are needed for breathing are actually disrupted. So the air or blood accumulating in the chest wall or that pleural space is also compromises the respiration system. Disruption of lung tissue. So anytime you have trauma or medical problems, they can compromise the ability of the alveoli to exchange the gases. So the less oxygen that gets in, the less carbon dioxide that gets out. And it can result in lower oxygen levels or hypoxia and high carbon dioxide levels, which is called hypercapnia. With respiratory compensation, so the body attempts to compensate for gas exchange deficits. The chemoreceptors detect changing oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and the brain stimulates the respiratory system to increase the rate and or the tidal volume. So next on to the blood. So there's 4 parts. There's the plasma, which is the liquid, then the red blood cells that contain the oxygen carrying hemoglobin, the white blood cells that fight the infections, and the platelets that form the clots. Plasma oncotic pressure. That is when the proteins in plasma attract water away from or around cells and pull it back into the bloodstream. Hydrostatic pressure is where water is pushed back out of the blood vessels toward the cells. Problems with these proteins can cause a very big imbalance. Blood dysfunction. Without enough blood, oxygen and carbon dioxide cannot properly be moved around, which then can cause bleeding, dehydration, anemia, and liver failure. Here is a network of arteries, veins, and capillaries. So the blood vessels take oxygenated blood from the lungs via the heart to the capillaries. Where the gas exchange takes place is between the cells and the capillaries. And the return of blood to the lungs via the heart for gas exchange is between the capillaries and the alveoli. So you need adequate pressure to make the cycle work, and pressure controlled by changing diameter of the blood vessels. The stretch receptors monitor the pressure, and the pressure can be increased or decreased depending on the situation. With the blood vessel dysfunction, you can have what's called loss of tone. So when the vessels lose the ability to constrict and dilate, the pressures then drop and can be from trauma, infection, or allergic reactions. Here's a normal blood vessel as well as a dilated vessel with reduced blood volume. You can also have excessive permeability, which is when the capillaries leak fluid out of their walls caused by severe infection or sepsis in high altitude and in certain diseases. Here is the permeable capillaries, which is increased permeability, which allows too much fluid to escape through the capillary walls. Next is hypertension. So it's a systemic vascular resistance, or also known as SVR, which is the pressure inside the vessels. So various conditions lead to abnormal constriction of the vessels, leading to an unhealthy and high pressure level. So major risk factors in stroke and heart disease. Next is loss of regulation. So the chemical messengers tell the blood vessels when to dilate and constrict. So if the signals are blocked, that's when problems arise. And then it has a lack of sympathetic response that can cause shock. Next, we'll talk about the heart, which is the pump with the average stroke volume or output of about 70 mL of blood per contraction. The stroke volume is based on preload, which is the amount of blood returning to the heart. Contractility is how hard the heart actually squeezes. And then afterload is the pressure that the heart has to pump against to force the blood out and into the system. Next, we'll talk about cardiac output. The first one is stroke volume. So stroke volume times beat per minute equals cardiac output. Then the slowing of the heart rate or decreasing stroke volume reduces that cardiac output. Very fast heart rates reduce cardiac output, so the inadequate time for heart to refill between the contractions. Pediatric compensation. So infants and young children rely on the heart rate to compensate for poor perfusion. They lack contractile muscles and cannot regulate the force of the contraction. That's when fast heart rates indicate that they're starting to compensate. Mechanical problems can be physical trauma, squeezing forces, or cell death, which is heart attack. And then electrical problems can be damage to the heart's electrical system, and the cause unorganized rhythms and rate problems. So the cardiopulmonary system and putting it all together. So the entire cardiopulmonary system must work together to maintain life. It must be a balance between ventilations and perfusion for the system to work properly. So they have the VQ match. The VQ ratio can be disrupted by any challenge to the cardiopulmonary system. All right, in this section we're going to talk about shock, and this is a very important thing to know and understand. So first is perfusion, which is the regular delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cells and removal of waste products. Hypoperfusion or inadequate perfusion is called shock. The breakdown in the system can result in death of the patient. There's 4 categories of shock, and I highly recommend knowing and understanding this. So read in your book what the shocks are in the 4 categories. But to break it down in quick terms, hypovolemic is low blood volume. Distributive is low blood vessel tone. Cardiogenic is when the heart fails to pump. and obstructive is when the blood cannot flow. Recognizing compensation is very important. So it's when problems arise and the body attempts to compensate. So signs of compensated shock are slight mental status changes, increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, delayed capillary refill time, pale, cool, clammy skin, and sweating. Decompensated shock occurs when compensatory measures fail, so it's characterized by decreased blood pressure and altered mental status. Then you have irreversible shock that occurs when inadequately perfused organ systems begin to die, so the patient death is commonly followed. In this section, we're going to talk about pathophysiology of other systems. First, we'll talk about fluid balance. So the body is 60% water. Intracellular is 70%. Intravascular is 5%. And interstitial is 25%. Water comprises approximately 60% of the body weight. The water is distributed in the three spaces, remembering the intracellular, intravascular, and interstitial. Brain and kidneys regulate thirst and the elimination of excess fluid. Blood plasma proteins pull fluid into the bloodstream, and cell membrane and capillary permeability regulate the flow in and out. Next is disruptions of fluid balance. So fluid loss causes dehydration, and it decreases in the total water volume. Poor fluid distribution is when the water is not getting to where it needs to go, causing edema or swelling associated with the movement of water. Next is the nervous system. This is where the brain and the spinal cord are well protected by the bone and muscle. It is covered by several protective layers, which is called the meninges, and a layer of shock absorbing fluid, which is the cerebral spinal fluid. Still subject to damage from trauma or disease though. In trauma, it can be caused by motor vehicle crashes, falls, and diving accidents. Medical dysfunction can be strokes, infection with like meningitis or encephalitis, diseases like Lou Gehrig's disease or MS, and then low blood sugar or what's also known as hypoglycemia. Next, we'll talk about the endocrine system. So the glands secrete the hormones, and then the hormones send chemical messages to the body to control body functions. Major organs of the system are the brain, the kidneys, the pancreas, the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, and adrenal glands. With the endocrine system dysfunctions, organs or glands can be the problem. Present at birth or result of an illness. Too many hormones, the Graves' disease, which is too much thyroid hormone, or problems with the heart rate and temperature regulation, or not enough hormones like type 1 diabetes. Adrenal insufficiencies, which affect the steroid hormones cortisol and aldosterone. Medications that suppress the immune system suppress the adrenal function, and it can result if the patient stops taking the prescribed steroids. Next is the digestive system, which allows food, water, or other nutrients to enter the body. So the major organs of the system include the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines. Next is the digestive dysfunction. It impacts hydration levels and nutrient transfer. The gastrointestinal bleeding can be slow, and it can be a chronic bleeding. It can be massive with rectal bleeding and or vomiting blood. Vomiting and diarrhea are the most common disorders. There's a variety of causes and may result in malnutrition and dehydration. Next is the immune system, which is responsible for fighting infection. It responds to specific body invaders by identifying them, marking them, and then destroying them. The next one we'll talk about is hypersensitivity or allergic reaction. So the allergic reaction can be from certain foods, drugs, or other substances. The result of an exaggerated immune response, and chemicals affect more than just the invader. It can produce edema and results in a rapid drop in the blood pressure, and this can be very life-threatening. All right, let's go over the chapter review for the principles of pathophysiology. Pathophysiology allows us to understand how negative forces impact the normal function of the body. Pathophysiology helps us understand how common disorders cause changes in the body. Understanding how the body compensates for insults sheds light on the signs and symptoms we may see during assessments. Understanding what compensation looks like helps us rapidly identify potentially life-threatening problems. Remember that cellular metabolism requires a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. Absence of either of these components disrupts normal metabolism. Cardiopulmonary system combines the function of the respiratory and cardiovascular systems to provide oxygen at the cellular level. Remember that shock occurs when the cardiopulmonary system fails and the cells become hypoperfused. The body is composed primarily of water, and this fluid is distributed throughout the body's systems. So, questions to consider. When evaluating a patient with a cardiac problem, consider the impact on the respiratory system. When evaluating a patient with a respiratory problem, consider the impact on the cardiovascular system. What impacts do the problems in these systems have on each other? Shock must be recognized immediately. What is the pathophysiology of shock? You are treating a patient who was recently released from the intensive care unit with a massive infection or sepsis. This has impaired the patient's ability to regulate the size of the blood vessels. How might this affect the patient's ability to compensate for additional illnesses? What steps should you take to help this patient compensate?